Let him sleep here tonight.
The winter of 1883 didn't just freeze the Bitterroot Mountains, it buried the weak. When a grieving widow and her 9 starving children were cast into a screaming blizzard to die, they didn't find heaven. They found a scarred, solitary mountain man, a loaded rifle, and a bloody past. The wind howling down from Lolo Pass felt less like weather and more like a punishment from God. Elara Abernathy stood in the freezing mud of her own front yard, her trembling hands wrapped around her youngest, infant William, who was wrapped in a threadbare wool blanket. Around her, the remaining 8 children huddled together like a frightened flock of sheep, their faces pale and pinched with a terror they were too young to fully comprehend. It had been exactly 3 weeks since her husband, Arthur Abernathy, was brought home in the back of a buckboard wagon, his body broken from what the local sheriff called a wild horse stampede. Elara knew better. Arthur was a master horseman. He had also been the only homesteader stubbornly refusing to sell his fertile acreage along Orofino Creek to the Cleary Land and Cattle Company. Amos Cleary, a man whose wealth was only matched by his profound cruelty, sat atop a massive roan stallion, watching the eviction with cold, impassive eyes. He was flanked by 3 of his hired enforcers, men with hard eyes and holstered Colt peacemakers. Among them was Blackjack Tom Higgins, a notorious gun-for-hire from the Dakota Territory. The bank called the note Mrs. Abernathy, Cleary said, his voice easily cutting through the rising howl of the impending storm. Arthur took out a significant advance against next year's harvest, a harvest he's no longer here to bring in. You have no money, no husband, and no legal right to stand on my dirt. It's a forged note, Amos, and you know it, Elara yelled back, her voice cracking not from fear, but from a profound, helpless rage. Arthur never borrowed a dime from you. You murdered him for this land. Cleary simply tipped his Stetson, a mock gesture of courtesy. A grieving mind conjures wild fantasies. The sheriff has seen the paperwork. The deed is mine. Now, I suggest you take your brood and start walking toward Blackwood Gulch. If you're caught on my property by nightfall, Higgins here has orders to treat you like trespassing squatters. 14-year-old Thomas, the eldest of the Abernathy children, stepped in front of his mother, his jaw set in a rigid imitation of his late father. He held a rusted splitting axe, his knuckles white. "You let her be! We ain't leaving!" Elara quickly pulled Thomas back by his suspenders. She saw Higgins's hand casually drop to the handle of his revolver, a sick smile playing on his lips. "No, Tommy," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Put it down. They want an excuse. Don't give them one." With only a single handcart loaded with whatever blankets, dried venison, and cast-iron cookware they could scramble together in an hour, the Abernathy family was forced onto the treacherous North Trail. They were driven out just as the sky turned a bruised, violent purple. The temperature was dropping fast, slipping well below 0. Blackwood Gulch was 15 miles away. In the spring, it was a half-day's ride. In a Bitterroot Mountain blizzard, on foot, with 9 children ranging from 14 years to 6 months old, it was a death sentence. By the second hour, the snow was falling so thick and fast that Elara could barely see the trees lining the trail. The snowdrifts quickly grew to knee-height, making every step an agonizing exertion. 7-year-old Nellie began to cough, a deep, rattling sound that tore at Elara's soul. The twins, Caleb and Joshua, were crying silently, the tears freezing to their cheeks. "Keep moving, my darlings," Elara urged, her voice hoarse, pushing the heavy handcart from behind while Thomas pulled from the front. "Just put one foot in front of the other. We must keep moving." But disaster struck at the 3rd mile. The left wheel of the overloaded cart struck a hidden, jagged rock beneath the snow. With a sickening crack of aged pine, the axle snapped. The cart violently pitched sideways, spilling their meager survival supplies into the deep, powdering snow. Thomas fell to his knees in the white drift, his chest heaving, his spirit finally breaking. "I'm sorry, Ma," he sobbed, the wind stealing the words from his mouth. "I can't lift it. I'm sorry." Elara dropped to her knees beside him, pulling him into an embrace, then frantically gathered her younger children, Sarah, James, Mary, Samuel, and the twins into a tight circle around her. The cold was a physical weight now, piercing their inadequate coats, biting into their flesh. She knew the signs of freezing to death, the painful shivering that eventually gives way to a lethal, sleepy warmth. They had maybe an hour left before the mountain claimed them all. "Lord," Alara prayed aloud, her tears instantly freezing on her eyelashes. "I do not ask for my own life, but do not let my children die in this snow. Please, show me a way." Suddenly, through the blinding whiteout, 14-year-old Thomas pointed a trembling, frostbitten finger toward the tree line. "Ma. Ma, look." It wasn't a light, but a scent. The faint, unmistakable, metallic tang of burning pine and wood smoke. Driven by the primal instinct to survive, Alara forced her children to their feet. Leaving the broken cart behind, they staggered blindly toward the scent of smoke, moving off the marked trail and plunging deeper into the treacherous, ascending timber of the mountainside. The source of the smoke remained hidden until they were nearly on top of it. Tucked away in a deep ravine built directly into the sheer face of a granite cliff stood a massive, heavily fortified cabin. It was a fortress of thick, unpeeled ponderosa pine logs, its roof buried under feet of snow, making it look almost like a natural extension of the mountain itself. Heavy wooden shutters were barred shut over the windows. Alara pounded her numb fists against the heavy oak door. "Please! Help us! My children are freezing!" For a long moment, there was only the sound of the howling wind. Alara pounded again, leaving smears of blood from her cracked knuckles on the rough wood. "In the name of God, open the door!" The heavy iron latch clattered, and the door swung inward. Standing in the threshold was a terrifying figure. He stood well over 6 feet tall, draped in a massive, heavy grizzly bear coat. A thick, unkempt beard obscured the lower half of his face, but it couldn't hide the jagged, angry scar that cut a cruel line from his left temple down to his jawbone. His eyes were the color of slate cold, hard, and deeply mistrustful. In his massive hands, he held a lever-action Henry rifle, the barrel leveled squarely at Alara's chest. This was Samuel Croft. The townsfolk of Blackwood Gulch whispered about him in hushed, fearful tones. A veteran of a forgotten war, a ruthless trapper, a hermit who warned trespassers with bullets rather than words. "Get off my claim," Samuel growled, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that sounded like grinding stones. He didn't lower the rifle. "I don't abide company, and I don't take in strays. I beg of you," Alara pleaded, her voice trembling. "We were run off our land. Our wagon broke. We have nowhere to go, and my babies. They are dying." Samuel's hard eyes flicked from Alara to the huddled mass of shivering bodies behind her. He saw Thomas bravely trying to shield his sisters. He saw little Nellie, her lips completely blue, her eyes rolling back in her head. He saw the infant clutch desperately to Alara's chest, a muscle feathered in Samuel's jaw. He had moved to this unforgiving mountain specifically to escape the cruelty of humanity, to never be responsible for another living soul after the tragedies of his past. He knew the rules of the wild. The weak perish, so the strong survive. It was nature's law. He looked back at Alara's desperate, tear-streaked face. For a fleeting second, a ghost of a memory flashed behind his slate-gray eyes, a memory of another woman, another time, another tragedy he couldn't stop. Samuel slowly lowered the barrel of the Henry rifle. He stepped back into the shadows of the cabin, leaving the door open to the warmth radiating from within. "Let them sleep here tonight," the mountain man said softly. Alara didn't hesitate. She ushered her freezing children inside, practically dragging the younger ones over the threshold. The interior of the cabin was remarkably large, warmed by a roaring fire in a massive stone hearth. The walls were lined with traps, stretched pelts, and well-oiled tools. It was austere, smelling of leather, smoke, and dried herbs, but to the Abernathy family, it was a palace. Samuel didn't speak another word immediately. He barred the heavy door behind them, shutting out the screaming blizzard. He moved with a surprising, quiet grace for a man of his size. He grabbed several thick wolf and buffalo hides from a heavy timber bed in the corner and tossed them onto the floor near the hearth. "Strip their wet coats off," Samuel ordered, his tone devoid of warmth but highly practical. "Wrap them in those. If their fingers and toes are white, don't rub them by the fire. It'll kill the flesh. Put them in lukewarm water." Elara quickly set to work, Thomas helping her strip the frozen outer layers off the younger children. Samuel moved to a large cast-iron pot swinging over the fire, taking a wooden ladle and filling several tin cups with a thick, boiling elk stew. He handed them out silently. When he handed a cup to Elara, their fingers brushed. His hands were calloused and scarred, radiating heat. "Thank you," Elara whispered, looking up into his face. "Mr. Croft." "Samuel Croft," he muttered, quickly pulling his hand away and stepping back toward the shadows of the room, as if the light of the fire revealed too much of him. "Don't unpack your lives, lady. You're gone at first light, assuming the storm breaks." "My name is Elara Abernathy," she said, ensuring he knew the name of the woman he had saved. "And this is Thomas, Sarah, James, Nellie, Caleb, Joshua, Mary, Samuel, and William." Samuel froze. He had been reaching for a piece of chopped firewood, but his hand stopped midair. He turned his head slowly, the firelight catching the severe angles of his scarred face. "Abernathy?" he repeated, his voice suddenly dangerously quiet. "Arthur Abernathy's kin?" Elara felt a sudden spike of cold fear that had nothing to do with the winter outside. "Arthur was my husband. He passed away 3 weeks ago." Samuel stood up to his full, imposing height. He walked toward a heavy wooden lockbox sitting on a sturdy oak desk in the corner of the room. He unlocked it with a heavy iron key from his belt, pulled out a stack of weathered folded papers, and tossed a single sheet onto the rough-hewn dining table in front of Elara. It was a legal deed, heavily stamped by the territorial governor. "Arthur didn't pass away, Mrs. Abernathy," Samuel said, his eyes burning with a dark, terrifying intensity. "He was murdered, just like my brother was murdered 5 years ago by the exact same men." Elara stared at the mountain man, her breath hitching in her throat as she looked down at the paper. At the bottom, signed in black ink, was the name Amos Cleary, alongside another signature she recognized with a jolt of shock, a signature belonging to someone who was supposed to be Arthur's closest friend. The mountain man wasn't just a random savior in the snow. He was a piece of a deadly puzzle Elara hadn't even known she was trying to solve. Elara stared at the heavy parchment, the firelight casting dancing shadows across the rigid black ink. The signature next to Amos Cleary's didn't belong to a stranger. It belonged to Josiah Miller. Josiah was the town magistrate of Blackwood Gulch. He had eaten Sunday supper at their table for a decade. He was the man who had stood beside Arthur as his best man, the man who had baptized their twins, Caleb and Joshua. "Josiah," Elara whispered, her voice entirely devoid of breath, as if the word itself had punched the life from her lungs. He told me the bank had no choice. He said he tried to fight Amos Cleary for us. He wept at Arthur's funeral." Samuel let out a harsh, humorless sound that was more of a scrape than a laugh. He moved back to the hearth, tossing a heavy log onto the flames. Sparks flew up the stone chimney like angry fireflies. "Tears are cheap, Mrs. Abernathy. Cheaper than the dirt they want to steal." Elara looked up, her blue eyes hardened by a sudden, violent clarity. "You said your brother was murdered." Samuel stopped moving. The broad expanse of his back tensed beneath his wool shirt. For a long minute, the only sound in the cabin was the shrieking wind outside and the rhythmic, soft breathing of 9 exhausted children sleeping on the floor. "Elias," Samuel finally said, his voice dropping an octave, thick with a grief that had fermented into pure, undiluted rage. 5 years ago, Elias homesteaded a patch of rock up near the limestone ridges. It wasn't good for farming, but he didn't care. He just wanted the quiet. But then he found a vein of silver. He brought a sample down to Josiah Miller to be assayed. Samuel turned around, the fire illuminating the brutal scar on his face. 3 days later, Elias was found dead at the bottom of a ravine. Cleary's sheriff, called it a tragic rockslide. A week after that, Amos Cleary's mining company suddenly had a legal deed to Elias's land, notarized by Josiah Miller. Just like Arthur, Alara murmured, connecting the dark, bloody dots. Arthur's Land, Orofino Creek. It's the only reliable water source through the valley. And the Northern Pacific Railroad is surveying a new spur right through that valley, Samuel added, leaning against the heavy timber beam of the mantelpiece. Cleary knows that whoever controls the creek controls the railroad's money. Your husband was sitting on a gold mine, and he refused to sell. So they arranged a stampede, and Josiah Miller forged the transfer of the deed to make it look like your husband settled a massive fabricated debt just before he died. Alara sank onto a wooden stool, burying her face in her hands. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal threatened to crush her. She had been cast out into a blizzard not by a faceless bank, but by a coordinated, bloodthirsty conspiracy designed by men she had trusted. Samuel watched her silently. He was not a man of gentle comforts. He had spent half a decade shutting out the world, communicating only with the brutal elements of the Bitterroot Mountains. Yet, as he looked at this fierce, resilient woman who had dragged 9 children through a whiteout blizzard, something ancient and deeply buried within his chest began to ache. He walked over to a wooden cabinet, retrieved a small glass bottle of amber liquid, and poured a modest measure into a clean tin cup. He walked over and set it on the table in front of her. "Drink," he ordered softly. "It's Kentucky bourbon. It'll chase the frost out of your bones." Alara looked up, taking the cup with trembling hands. The liquor burned a fiery trail down her throat, settling into a heavy warmth in her stomach. "What do I do, Mr. Croft?" "I cannot let Amos Cleary build his empire on my husband's blood. But I have nothing. Look at them." She gestured to the pile of sleeping children. "They are my whole world. If I fight Cleary, he will kill me too." Samuel looked at the children. Young Thomas was sleeping with his arm protectively draped over his little sister, Nellie. The infant, William, was sleeping soundly in a hollowed-out wooden cradle Samuel had quickly fashioned from a split log. "You survive the night," Samuel said, his slate-gray eyes meeting hers. "That's what you do first. You survive." The blizzard raged for 4 relentless days, burying the mountain in a fortress of impenetrable white. Inside the cabin, a strange, fragile domesticity took root. Alara was a woman of relentless industry. She refused to accept charity without contributing. She mended Samuel's torn wool shirts with careful, precise stitches. She took over the cooking, turning his rough stores of dried meat, beans, and root vegetables into hearty, deeply flavorful meals that left the children with full bellies and color in their cheeks. Samuel, to his own profound shock, found himself adjusting to the chaos. He taught 7-year-old Nellie how to whittle a wooden whistle. He showed the twins, Caleb and Joshua, how to oil the intricate mechanics of a Colt revolver, ensuring it wouldn't jam in the cold. And with Thomas, the eldest, Samuel was strict but deeply respectful, recognizing the boy's desperate need to be the man of the house. He taught Thomas how to read the mountain winds and how to set a snare trap that would kill quickly and mercifully. One evening, as Alara was washing tin plates in a basin of hot water, Samuel walked up beside her to dry them with a linen cloth. They stood shoulder to shoulder. The scent of her lye soap, wood smoke, and something uniquely warm and floral wrapped around him, an intoxicating contrast to the sterile smell of snow and pine he was used to. "You have brought life into a tomb, Alara," Samuel said quietly, not looking at her, keeping his eyes on the plate in his hands. It was the first time he had used her given name. Alara paused, her hands in the soapy water. She looked up at his profile, studying the harsh lines of his face, the scar that spoke of incredible violence, and the eyes that held a surprising, guarded tenderness. "You are not a tomb, Samuel," she replied softly. "You are just a man who forgot how to leave the door unlocked." He turned to look at her, the proximity sending a sudden, electric jolt through them both. For a moment, the world outside Amos Cleary, the corrupted town, the bloody deeds vanished. There was only the heat of the fire, the quiet breathing of the children, and the magnetic pull between 2 shattered people finding a jagged edge that fit perfectly together. But the mountain was a cruel master, and peace was only ever an illusion. On the morning of the 5th day, the wind finally died. The sun broke over the jagged peaks of the Bitterroots, blindingly bright against the fresh, undisturbed powder. The storm had broken, Down in the valley of Blackwood Gulch, Amos Cleary stood by the frosted window of his lavishly appointed office above the bank. He swirled a glass of expensive brandy, a deep frown carving lines into his forehead. "You're telling me," Cleary said, his voice a dangerous, quiet hiss, "that a woman pushing a broken handcart with 9 brats somehow survived the worst squall of the decade?" Blackjack Tom Higgins lounged in a leather chair, picking his teeth with a silver splinter. "I ain't saying she survived, boss. I'm saying Deacon Cobb found tracks. The cart broke about 3 miles up the North Trail. But there weren't no bodies. Footprints headed off the trail, straight up towards the granite ridges. Josiah Miller, the magistrate, sat nervously wringing his hands in the corner. The granite ridges? Good God, Amos, that's Samuel Croft's territory." Cleary's eyes darkened. He knew the name well. He had spent 5 years avoiding that particular stretch of the mountain. Croft is a madman. He shoots trespassers on sight. Maybe, Higgins smirked. Or maybe he took pity on a freezing widow. Either way, if she's alive, she's a loose end. If she makes it to the federal marshal in Missoula and disputes the deed with that forged signature. Higgins cast a mocking glance at the trembling magistrate. "Josiah here is going to hang, and you're going to lose the railroad contract." Cleary slammed his glass onto the mahogany desk. "Take 5 men. Take Deacon Cobb to track them. Go up that mountain, Higgins. Burn the cabin to the ash. If Croft gets in the way, put him in the ground next to his brother. Just make sure none of the Abernathys ever come down that mountain." Up at the cabin, Samuel was already preparing for war. He knew how men like Cleary operated. They didn't leave things to chance. "The snow is crusted," Samuel told Alara, methodically loading heavy, brass-cased cartridges into his bandolier. "It'll support the weight of a horse. They'll send riders today to verify you're dead. When they don't find bodies, they'll find my tracks." "We can run," Alara said, her heart hammering as she instinctively gathered little Nellie into her arms. "We can go higher into the pass." "No," Samuel said firmly, snapping the loading gate of his Henry rifle shut. "You'd freeze by nightfall. Besides, I'm done running, Alara. I ran 5 years ago when Elias died. I ain't running from these bastards again." He handed Alara a loaded, double-barreled shotgun. "You keep this. You stay in the root cellar beneath the floorboards with the children. No matter what you hear up here, you do not come out until I open that hatch." Before Alara could argue, the front door burst open. 14-year-old Thomas stumbled inside, his face pale, gasping for air. He had gone out to check the rabbit snares at the edge of the tree line. "Riders," Thomas gasped, pointing back out the door. "6 of 'em, coming up the ridge. Down. Now," Samuel roared, grabbing the heavy iron ring on the floorboards and hauling the trapdoor open. Alara didn't hesitate. She ushered the crying children down the wooden ladder into the dark, earthy cellar. Thomas hesitated, grabbing his rusted splitting axe from the corner. "I'm staying with you," the boy said, his chin trembling but his eyes fierce. "You get down there and protect your mother, boy," Samuel commanded, shoving Thomas toward the hole. "That is your job." Reluctantly, Thomas descended. Samuel slammed the heavy oak door shut, throwing the iron rug over it. He then moved quickly to the heavy wooden shutters, unbarring a narrow firing slit. Outside, 50 yards from the cabin, 6 riders broke through the tree line. They were heavily armed, their horses breathing plumes of white steam into the freezing air. At the front was Blackjack Tom Higgins, a lever-action Winchester resting casually across his saddle pommel. "Croft," Higgins shouted, his voice echoing off the granite cliffs. "We know you're in there, and we know who you're hiding. We represent the legal authority of Blackwood Gulch." Samuel slipped the barrel of his Henry rifle through the firing slit. He didn't waste breath on warnings. He took a steady breath, aligned the iron sights with the chest of the man sitting next to Higgins' Deacon Cobb, the tracker, and squeezed the trigger. Crack! The thunderous roar of the rifle shattered the mountain's silence. Deacon Cobb was thrown backward off his horse, dead before he hit the snow. Chaos erupted. The remaining 5 riders spurred their horses behind the thick cover of the ponderosa pines, unleashing a hail of lead toward the cabin. Bullets splintered the thick logs, shattered the clay pots on the porch, and thudded heavily against the fortified door. Samuel moved like a phantom within the dark cabin. He fired from one slit, then rolled across the floor to fire from another, ensuring the posse couldn't pin down his position. He worked the lever of his rifle with terrifying speed, a one-man army operating with deadly, practiced precision. A second rider fell, screaming, clutching a shattered femur as his horse bolted. "Burn him out!" Higgins roared from behind a massive boulder. "Throw the pitch!" One of the men, holding a glass bottle filled with kerosene and a burning rag, stepped out from behind a tree to hurl it at the cabin roof. Samuel didn't aim for the man. He aimed for the bottle. Crack. The bullet shattered the glass mid-air. The kerosene ignited instantly, showering the man in a horrific blanket of liquid fire. His screams echoed through the ravine as he dropped to the snow, rolling frantically. Down in the cellar, Elara held her hands over her children's ears, praying fervently as the floorboards above them shook with the deafening concussions of gunfire and the muffled, agonizing screams of dying men. Suddenly, the gunfire stopped. An eerie, ringing silence fell over the mountain. Samuel remained motionless by the window, sweat stinging his eyes, despite the freezing cold. He scanned the tree line, 2 dead, 1 wounded, 1 burned. That left Higgins and 1 other man. "Croft," Higgins's voice called out again. But this time, it sounded different, closer. And there was a sick, triumphant sneer in his tone. "Look what I found trying to sneak out the back to be a hero." Samuel's blood ran cold. He moved to a different firing slit that gave him an angle on the side of the cabin. Standing in the snow, 20 yards away, was Tom Higgins. And he wasn't alone. He had a tight, brutal grip on the collar of Thomas Abernathy's coat, the barrel of his Colt revolver pressed firmly against the 14-year-old boy's temple. Thomas had disobeyed Samuel. He had crawled out the small coal chute at the back of the cellar, armed with nothing but a rusted axe, trying to flank the attackers. "Drop the rifle and open the door, mountain man," Higgins yelled, cocking the hammer of the revolver. "Or I blow this boy's brains all over the snow, and then we smoke the rest of the rats out of the hole." Inside the cabin, Samuel lowered his rifle. The ghosts of his past screamed at him, merging with the terrifying reality of the present. He could not let another innocent blood spill on this mountain. He could not let Elara lose her son. Samuel unbarred the heavy oak door and stepped out onto the porch, his hands raised, the cold wind whipping his grizzly coat around him. The wind whipped across the blood-stained snow, carrying the metallic scent of fresh death. Samuel Croft stood on the porch, his massive frame exposed, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender he hadn't used since the brutal trenches of the Civil War. "Well, now," Blackjack Tom Higgins sneered, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He kept the barrel of his Colt firmly pressed against 14-year-old Thomas's temple. The boy was trembling, his lip busted and bleeding, but his eyes were locked on Samuel, burning with a fierce, terrified defiance. The ghost of the Bitterroots, brought to heel by a stray pup. "Let the boy walk, Higgins," Samuel said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that resonated in his chest. "You want me for Cobb and the others. You want the deed. You have me. There's no bounty on the kid. Let him go." From behind a thick ponderosa pine, the last surviving outlaw, a lanky, rat-faced man known in the territory as Dutch Loper, stepped out, his Winchester rifle leveled squarely at Samuel's chest. "Don't listen to him, Tom," Dutch spat, nervously eyeing the bodies of his comrades in the snow. "Cleary said leave no loose ends. We put them both in the dirt and smoked the woman out." Inside the cabin, Elara Abernathy heard every word through the heavy timber door. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked down at the open trapdoor. Her 8 younger children were huddled in the dark cellar, weeping silently. She had already lost Arthur to the greed of men like Amos Cleary. She would absolutely not lose her eldest son, nor the man who had sheltered them from the storm. Elara's gaze fell upon the heavy, double-barreled scattergun Samuel had pressed into her hands. The iron was freezing to the touch. She didn't know much about firearms, but Samuel had shown her the hammers and the triggers. "You survive," Samuel had told her. Elara gripped the stock, her knuckles turning white. She didn't wait for a miracle. She became one. Outside, Higgins chuckled darkly, cocking the hammer of his revolver. "Sorry, Croft." The boss pays for a clean slate. Samuel locked eyes with Thomas. In that split second, a silent, primal communication passed between the mountain man and the boy he had taught to set snares. "Fight like the wolf," Samuel's eyes commanded. As Higgins's finger tightened on the trigger, Thomas violently threw his head back, smashing his skull directly into Higgins's nose with a sickening crunch. Simultaneously, the boy drove his heavy leather boot down onto the outlaw's instep. Higgins bellowed in pain, stumbling backward. His revolver fired, the bullet whizzing inches past Thomas's ear and shattering an icicle hanging from the cabin roof. Samuel lunged off the porch like an uncoiled spring, reaching for the heavy hunting knife sheathed in his belt. Dutch Loper panicked, swinging his Winchester toward Samuel to fire. The heavy oak door of the cabin flew open. "Get away from my son!" Alara screamed. She leveled the heavy scattergun, bracing the stock against her hip just as Samuel had instructed, and pulled the front trigger. Boom! The deafening roar of the shotgun echoed through the ravine. A cloud of thick, white smoke erupted from the doorway. Dutch Loper was violently thrown backward into the snowbank, his right shoulder shredded by buckshot, his rifle flying uselessly into the brush. He lay there, writhing and screaming in agony. Samuel didn't hesitate. He tackled the disoriented Higgins to the ground. The two massive men rolled through the snow in a brutal, desperate struggle. Higgins desperately tried to bring his revolver to bear, but Samuel clamped a vice-like grip onto the outlaw's wrist, slamming it against a submerged rock until the gun fell free. With a roar fueled by 5 years of buried grief, Samuel mounted Higgins, drawing his hunting knife and pressing the razor-sharp steel directly against the outlaw's throat. A thin line of crimson bloomed against Higgins's skin. "For Elias," Samuel whispered, his slate-gray eyes entirely devoid of mercy. "Wait!" Alara yelled, dropping the empty shotgun and running through the snow, dropping to her knees beside them. "Samuel! No!" Samuel's chest heaved. The bloodlust was a physical roar in his ears. "If you kill him now, you are exactly what Amos Cleary says you are," Alara pleaded, her hand reaching out to firmly grasp Samuel's thick wrist. Her touch was warm, grounding him to reality. "We have the forged deeds. We have the survivor," she pointed to the moaning Dutch Loper. "And we have Higgins. We don't bury them in the snow. We drag them into the light." Samuel stared down at the terrified eyes of the assassin. Slowly, the murderous tension drained from his shoulders. He withdrew the knife, flipped it, and brought the heavy brass pommel crashing down onto Higgins's temple, knocking the man out cold. "Get the rope," Samuel muttered, looking up at Alara with a profound, exhausted gratitude. 2 days later, a strange procession rode into the bustling railroad town of Missoula, 40 miles north of Blackwood Gulch. Samuel Croft rode at the front, his heavy grizzly coat making him look like an avenging spirit of the mountains. Behind him rode Alara and Thomas, holding the reins of 2 pack horses. Bound tightly to those horses were a heavily bandaged Dutch Loper and a bruised Tom Higgins. They bypassed local law enforcement entirely and rode straight to the office of U.S. Federal Marshal Elias Bass, a man known throughout the territory for his incorruptible nature and deep hatred for land barons. When Samuel dropped the locked box containing his brother's original deed onto Marshal Bass's desk, and Alara presented the forged deed bearing Josiah Miller's signature, the pieces of a 5-year conspiracy clicked perfectly into place. Faced with a federal hanging, Dutch Loper eagerly turned state's evidence, confessing to the entire operation. The murder of Elias Croft, the staged stampede that killed Arthur Abernathy, and the violent eviction of Alara and her children. The arrests happened before sundown. Amos Cleary was dragged from his lavish office, screaming about his wealth and influence, right up until Marshal Bass struck him across the jaw with the barrel of a peacemaker. Magistrate Josiah Miller wept in his jail cell, realizing his 30 pieces of silver had bought him a date with the gallows. Justice in the West was often slow, but when it arrived, it was absolute. A month later, the spring thaw finally broke the icy grip of the Bitterroot Mountains. Orofino Creek was running high and clear. Alara Abernathy stood on the porch of her reclaimed homestead, watching her children run and play in the warming sun. The broken axle of their handcart had been repaired, but it sat unused in the barn. They were home. Samuel Croft rode into the yard on his massive black gelding. He had spent the last month helping Alara rebuild the fences and restock the winter stores Amos Cleary had plundered. He dismounted, tying his horse to the rail. He looked restless, his eyes drifting up toward the towering granite ridges where his isolated cabin sat empty. "The valley is safe now," Samuel said gruffly, taking off his hat and turning the brim in his scarred hands. "Cleary is awaiting the judge. The bank backed off. Thomas has a good handle on the plow. I reckon my work is done down here." Alara wiped her hands on her apron and walked down the steps. She stopped inches from him, looking up into the slate-gray eyes that no longer looked so cold. "Are you running away again, Samuel Croft?" she asked softly. "I don't belong in valleys, Alara. I'm a mountain man. I don't know how to live around folks." "You knew how to save 9 children in a blizzard," she replied, reaching out to gently trace the edge of the scar on his cheek. He didn't flinch. He leaned into her touch. "You knew how to spare a man's life when your heart demanded blood. The mountain kept you safe, Samuel, but it's time to come back to the world." She stepped closer, wrapping her arms around his waist, resting her head against the heavy wool of his shirt. "Let them sleep here tonight," she whispered, echoing the words that had saved her life. "And tomorrow night, and every night after." Samuel closed his eyes, his massive arms slowly wrapping around her, holding her tighter than he had ever held a rifle. For the first time in his life, the mountain man realized he didn't need to build a fortress of logs and stone to feel secure. He had found his sanctuary in the fierce, unyielding heart of Alara Abernathy. The winter of 1883 took much from Alara Abernathy, but the bitter snows also delivered salvation. Out of profound loss and brutal betrayal, a fiercely protective mother and a scarred mountain man forged an unbreakable bond. The wild frontier was built not just by those who fought the land, but by those who found the strength to love within its harshest storms.
Hi, my name is Ivy Dark Devotion, the owner and manager of Ivy Dark Devotion. After watching the video, she was driven out with 9 children. "Let them sleep here tonight," the mountain man said. "I really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel?" For me, the strongest part of this story was the simple act of kindness in a moment when someone had almost nowhere left to turn. It's a reminder that even small compassion can completely change the course of someone's night or even their life. The mountain man didn't need grand words to show humanity, and I think that's what made the moment feel so powerful and real emotionally. Do you think people today are too quick to turn away from someone in need? And have you ever experienced a moment where one person's kindness stayed with you for years afterward? Stories like this make me think about how we can all offer a little more patience and understanding in everyday life, even in quiet ways most people never notice. If this story connected with you in some way, feel free to leave a comment and share your thoughts. And if you enjoy these heartfelt mountain stories, you're always welcome to like and subscribe for more.